The Senate balks at pistol brace ban repeal. Plus, Popehat's Ken White on the ins and outs of Hunter Biden's plea deal. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter right now if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America. This week, will be talking about the hot topic, Hunter Biden and his new plea deal that includes him copping to a gun charge. That means we're going to have somebody who knows what they're talking about when it comes to federal crimes. And that person is former prosecutor and current criminal defense attorney, as well as co-host of the of a legal podcast, Ken White, who is also known as Popehat. Welcome to the show, Ken. Thanks for joining us.
Stephen, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
And what's the name of the podcast again? It's
Serious Trouble, about high-profile people getting into serious trouble.
Well, yeah. I mean, this is why I wanted to have you on. There's a high-profile person who has gotten himself into serious trouble, and but also at the same time, somewhat complicated situation given the nature of his deal that I think a lot of people, including myself, don't have full grasp of exactly the details, which is why I wanted to have somebody who knows a little bit more about the topic on than I do. So, why don't we start then with Hunter Biden and his plea deal / pretrial diversion agreement. Can you just walk us through exactly what he's agreed to here?
Sure. So Hunter Biden, who's been under investigation for years and has been negotiating with Department of Justice for years openly, has agreed to plead to, first of all, 2 tax misdemeanors. If you want to get hyper technical, this is Title 26, Section 7203, that makes it a crime to willfully fail to file a tax return when you're supposed to. And then he's also not pleading to, but agreed to enter a diversion program for a charge of possessing a gun while a prohibited person, specifically someone who is an addict or user of illegal drugs. And that's under Title 18, Section 922, which I know you know and write a lot about.
Yes. And the key point there, too, because I've seen a lot of misreporting on this, he's not copping to lying on the background check form when he bought the gun. He's copping to this charge of possessing the gun while being a drug user. Actually, I was wondering if you could shed any light as to why they would have gone that direction instead of the background check form.
It's a little speculative. It may be that because the lying charge, the 1001, is a little harder to prove, and that you have to prove like he was willfully lying, that he realized, at that moment, oh, I'm an addict, or, oh, I'm a habitual user, or whatever. That's the intent required.
Can he still be charged with that crime later down the line? Or how does this, I assume once you strike a deal like this with federal prosecutors, they're not coming back around to try and get you over basically a parallel crime.
Well, you got to read the back of your ticket really carefully, Stephen. You got to look at your plea agreement because it spells out exactly what they're agreeing to. And generally it says, we won't charge you further for this set of facts, but this deal binds only us, not other districts, other states, whatever. But in the vast number of cases, right, if you resolve this with a deal, they would not be coming back based on the same set of facts to charge you again.
Okay. So, I know his lawyer has said that they feel that this closes the investigation into him. I think that the district attorney in Delaware or the U.S. attorney, who was a Trump holdover, who was looking into all this from before Hunter's father became president, but has said something along the lines of this might not be completely over. I guess there's a little bit of uncertainty at that point.
Well, there's a line in the press release that says the investigation is ongoing. That could mean something, but it just could be boilerplate. Yeah. One of the things about following federal criminal law is that a ton of the stuff you see in the documents or in press releases or stuff like that, you think, why did they put that in there? And they put that in there because it's been in there since 1980 or something. It's not a thoughtful thing.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it sure seems like, at least as far as the gun purchase situation goes, or the gun ownership, that's resolved by this deal. But speaking of which, what exactly, as far as what's been reported, I think the New York Times had the details. We don't have the plea agreement, but we have reporting on it from the New York Times that indicates there are two conditions for this pretrial diversion program. But actually, before we get into that, pretrial diversion, right? What exactly happens here? He's being charged with this, but not really. Or I don't explain it for anyone who's not a lawyer, I guess.
Sure. The federal system, pretrial diversion just means that you've been charged, but they're going to suspend all proceedings. And if you stay out of trouble and do whatever it is the deal requires you to do for a period of time, then at the end it'll be dismissed. You won't be further prosecuted. You won't have a conviction.
And why is that different from like probation?
Well, because with probation, you wind up with a conviction. So probation is part of a criminal sentence. So to get probation, you have to be convicted of something. And so the federal system recognizes, sometimes maybe they don't want someone to have a conviction for something. First-time offenders, young people, extremely sympathetic circumstances, that type of thing. So sometimes you can get a diversion. It's more common in some districts than others. It's not particularly common here in LA. It's more common on the East Coast, I understand. But it's certainly a known thing. This is not a unique case. Okay.
And so he won't be a felon. That's not part of this deal. He's agreeing to plead guilty to misdemeanors, but the felony charge, which is the gun charge, that is in this pretrial diversion, which as long as he follows the conditions, which we'll get into in a second here, he won't become a felon at the end of it.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, the pretrial conditions, one of the interesting things, so the two that we have information on so far, one of them is the same punishment as if he had been convicted of a felony, which is that he can't own guns ever again. Is that a normal condition? How does that work? How can you give up your gun rights for life under a pretrial diversion program like this?
Well, I mean, you can contract away your rights all the time, and we do it every day. And you can contract away rights in plea resolutions of cases and investigations. A very common one is, you have a right to appeal your sentence, but it's very common when you plead guilty to a federal crime that they make you give up that right as part of the deal. Similarly, if you want a really good deal, and diversion is a good deal, then it's not surprising that they'd do something that make you give up something or make you agree to something that you might not want to do. And I think when you and I were talking earlier, you pointed out it's not clear that Hunter Biden was really into guns before or owned one before or anything like that. So we don't really know what this means to him. Yeah. But it's certainly it's a significant constitutional right he's giving up for life.
Yeah. The other condition seems much more run-of-the-mill obvious, which is that he can't do drugs for 24 months. So what happens if he fails either one of these conditions?
Well, there are two kind of sets of consequences. One set is that no matter what his sentence is on the tax misdemeanors, there's going to be a condition of probation if he gets probation, or supervised release if he spends a term in jail, that he not do illegal drugs and not break the law. So it would be a violation of that, and that would pose the chance that he would get revoked, meaning if he's on probation, they would haul him in, they might revoke probation and put him in jail. If he's on supervised release, think of supervised release kind of like what parole used to be. It's a term of supervision after you're done with jail. You could be sent back to jail. So there's that side of it. On the diversion side, not as clear. We're going to need to see what the deal says. But in theory, they could decide to go through with prosecuting the gun charge, the 18 USC 922 G3. Now, there would be some problems with that. Those may be surmountable, but there would be constitutional problems with it.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of that
Right.
later on in the show for sure, because there was a report that if this had gone to trial, that Biden was going to use Second Amendment defense, which is actually a fairly interesting thing in the post-Bruin landscape, and we'll talk about why in a little bit, especially when we're comparing his situation to some of the other people who've faced this kind of charge before. But overall, I just wanted to get your take, your feeling on whether this is a sweetheart deal, right? It's been called that by a lot of Republicans reacting. I know that there have been gun rights groups that have been unhappy with this situation as well. Do you feel like, let's just start with the specific things he's agreeing to and the charges that were brought, because there's obviously one part of this is like what was charged and whether the punishment for that is fair, and
Right.
what wasn't charged, and these other things that Hunter Biden has done that people, or at least he's been accused of doing, that aren't involved in this particular plea agreement. So let's just start with what he was charged with. Do you think this outcome, this deal that he struck, from what we know of it, is a fair one?
So in terms of what he's having to plead guilty to, the 2 misdemeanor counts for failing to file a return, my answer is yes. This is a relatively normal pre-indictment disposition. You're going to get a little better deal if you don't make them indict you, and you in effect agree before even being charged to plead guilty. He could hypothetically be charged more harshly with the felony of tax evasion, but practically speaking, that's hard to prove. That's not just willfully failing to file a return. It's basically having an intent to deceive the government, and usually you have to do something affirmative like file a false document or hide assets or something like that. And if you're just like in a cocaine haze for a couple of years and you don't file anything, that's not really tax evasion. It's also a tough charge to make, the more serious felony of tax evasion, because an incorrect belief about what the law is a defense, even if it's completely unreasonable. So if Hunter Biden thinks dudes on crack don't have to file taxes, if he thinks that sincerely, even if it's completely stupid, then that's not tax evasion. So that's how Wesley Snipes got off the hook on his felony tax charges, most likely.
Yeah. So Chris, I don't know much about the tax side of it,
right?
So I can't ask you too many follow-ups there. But the gun charge, this is my understanding, and from my reporting over the last couple of years following this case, I've spoken with Professor Drew Stevenson, who has written about this specific charge. This is about people who are drug users that own guns. Anyone who's a drug user and owns guns is a felon under federal law. And usually you see this crop up with things like medical marijuana being legalized in a lot of states, and how that interacts with federal law, where it's still illegal and still implicates this prohibition. But as far as Professor Stevenson says, this is a pretty uncommon charge as a standalone charge. And what I mean by standalone charge, because obviously he pled to 2 other charges, but they don't have anything to do with the gun purchase. The stuff surrounding the gun is just this one charge of him being a drug user and possessing firearms.
Right. So it is extremely rare.
He said there's only about 200 convictions a year where that's the only charge.
I would be surprised if it's that high, frankly.
Well, I would say one point of context, just real quick on that, is he did tell me that is where there's a conviction, which means that his belief there were probably other charges before, that basically the way this gets used in practice, and we'll talk about some specific examples later, but is that it's a tack-on charge. It's something that you add when there's a more serious either drug crime or gun crime involved, and it's either enhances the sentence that the suspect gets, or it can be used as a fallback, basically. If it's harder to prove the other crimes, if you catch someone with, a pound of meth in their car and a loaded gun, maybe you can charge them with a higher level drug crime, whether it's as a trafficker or a dealer, but you can also charge them with just this possession crime, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a crime that you almost never see in isolation, not connected to something else. So it's the type of crime that, like you said, is just like kitchen sink charging, where we're going to get this person for every single thing we can find. Or it's something you charge when you can't find another charge, but you really don't like the person. And so the case you brought up is that case where they charged the mom with this when the young kid took the gun into school and a teacher was accidentally shot. That's a classic example of, we're going to cast around to find something we can charge this person with. But it's in America right now, I think the statistics I saw most recently, or they estimate around 60 million people have used illegal drugs or abused prescription drugs in any given year. And a lot of those people own guns, and no significant portion of them are getting charged, nor is there any serious effort to charge any significant part of them. So this is something about federal law that a lot of people don't realize it's a little scary, is that there are all sorts of extremely broad, extremely flexible laws that huge groups of Americans are technically guilty of, that they can use against you if you want. So that's not a good thing, in my view, as a criminal defense attorney. But here, the types of situations where you see this charged are, for instance, when they're doing sort of task force actions or sweeps, we're going to bring in the feds to help us take out all the gang members in this town. A few of them get arrested, and this is the only thing they can find to charge them with. It gets charged like that. It gets charged when, like you said, they take down someone for a bunch of other things, and the federal prosecutor's pissed, so they throw this in too on top of everything else. Sometimes it gets charged as a vehicle to charge someone something more lenient if they're extenuating circumstances. But it's a really uncommon charge. I never saw it in the 6 years I was a federal prosecutor. I haven't seen it as a defense attorney, and it's only in unusual circumstances.
Okay.
The other thing to note about it, Stephen, is that it's relatively lenient in terms of punishment. So I've seen a lot of people claim, well, when the government comes after my gun clients, they come and they do years in prison.
Yeah,
well, that's because they're being charged with different things.
Right.
Right.
Is that basically this charge, in theory, could carry up to 10 years in prison with it, and Biden is getting a pretrial diversion program that features no prison time at all. But how does that comport with how this is usually handled?
It doesn't at all. So federal sentencing, the maximum sentence is rarely relevant. The way the sentence is determined is under a system called the Federal Sentencing Guidelines, which is an extremely, some would say, needlessly complex and geeky set of formulas and numbers. Depending on how geeky you are, it's either like filling out a tax return for a mid-sized business or like creating a second edition Dungeons and Dragons character. And under those guidelines, this particular crime of being an addict in possession of a gun has a recommended sentence that's quite low. In looking at the guidelines to prepare for this today, my read of it is someone without a criminal history who, is just an addict in possession of the gun. The recommended range would be 10 to 16 months. The judge would have discretion to go lower than that. And even if the judge were being a stickler, it's in a zone of the guidelines where you can do half of that in a halfway house and half in prison. So the idea that this crime typically gets a lot of time is just not right. Okay.
But what about the pretrial diversion program being used here? Is that a sweetheart thing for Biden in particular, or in someone in the same circumstance who's pleading to 2 misdemeanors and this particular gun crime, are they going to get that same treatment?
I don't see it as a sweetheart deal for him, and here's why. He's pleading to 2 federal tax misdemeanors in a way that someone in his circumstance would typically do. We're hearing reporting that they've promised to recommend probation. We don't know if that's true or not. I'm a little skeptical. That would be fairly lenient if it's true, because the guidelines would seem to be a little higher than that. But it's the judge who makes that call, what sentence he gets. But the thing is that if it were anyone but Hunter Biden, then I don't think they'd be making him do anything with a gun charge. The only reason they're been dropped, or yeah, it would have been wouldn't have been pursued at all. The only reason they're doing it is the man went and basically boasted about it in a published autobiography, which as a defense lawyer, I'm going to ask you all out there not to do. And second of all, because he's Hunter Biden and they're bending over backwards not to seem like they're cutting him some sort of deal. So I think if one of my clients, a relatively obscure person, and in the course of the tax investigation, they learned that at some point he was doing crack and he had a gun, I don't have any concern that they would charge that.
Okay. And so, I mean, this is kind of becoming a theme among our political class, where they're almost forcing these prosecutors into doing something in their cases because Hunter Biden, the story of how this all happened is pretty bizarre in and of itself, right? This is 2018. He buys this gun while he's, using drugs, using crack cocaine, according to himself, right? And the woman that he's seeing at the time, who also happens to be his brother's widow, finds the gun, is afraid that he might use it on himself. Apparently. And her solution to this was to throw it in a dumpster behind a grocery store which I would think 99 times out of 100, that gun's probably just going to end up in a landfill and no one's going to even realize this happened.
Right.
But in this circumstance, somebody dug through that dumpster and then turned it over to the local police, which is another thing that would seem unusual, right?
Yes.
Somebody who's digging through a dumpster and finds a gun actually turns that gun into the cops. Another kind of surprising thing. Then there's a report from Politico where the store owner who sold this gun to Biden said that the Secret Service showed up and tried to take the background check form records for the sale, which he refused to turn over, rightfully so, because the Secret Service has no jurisdiction and wasn't even providing protection to Hunter Biden at the time. That's another weird twist. But then, this all comes out mainly because of the Secret Service thing. There wasn't a lot of attention paid to Hunter Biden having a gun until that happened. It became sort of a political scandal. And at that point, a few weeks later, Hunter Biden's autobiography came out.
Right. And
the thing is, initially, there wasn't a lot of, it's fairly difficult, from my understanding, at least from what Professor Stevenson says, that it's fairly difficult to prove somebody is addicted to a drug in this circumstance of when they go to buy a gun.
Right.
When they're talking about whether they lied on the background check to prove that they were addicted or that they were knowingly lying. And so you have to not just show that they've used drugs at some point in the past, but that is a continuing thing during the period where they purchased and owned the gun. And there wasn't evidence for that necessarily at the time in 28, when this first came out. I think it was actually 2021. And until Biden himself did a media tour for his book where he talked about how he was smoking crack every 15 minutes. That's a quote from the book, obviously probably somewhat of an exaggeration, but and it's at that point, it's harder to not do anything if you're the prosecutor looking into this case, right?
Yeah. So there are a couple of elements here. I mean, federal criminal prosecution only hits a tiny, tiny percentage of the cases it could. So getting charged with a federal crime is a little like getting struck by lightning. The feds have much more resources than the state does. They have the ability to do things really slowly. They have all these institutional advantages, and they spend those by only taking a relatively small number of cases and hoping that like the deterrence factor will help them out. But one of the ways that works out is that if you get noticed, you're more likely to get charged, and then you're kind of screwed because they tend to only move forward when they have a very strong case. So it's sort of like, blowing through a stop sign in front of a cop. even if the cop doesn't typically pull people over for stop signs, if you blow the stop sign right in front of the cop, they're gonna say, I gotta pull you over.
Right.
Same thing with this. If you basically wave it in their face, they are going to think we just institutionally, we have to do something about this.
Yeah, that's kind of what it felt like when I was watching this unfold. It's like, well, he's out here saying he was addicted to drugs when he bought this gun while he's being investigated for that fact. And it's like, well, what are they supposed to do at that point?
One of the most constant themes, I'd say, of the last 10 or so years is this huge gulf between what is good politics and good PR and good marketing on the one hand, and what is good strategy for not going to prison on the other. And there's a big gulf between those two, and people have found it out to their regret.
And I think that you also touch on something that might explain some of the motivation or some of the inspiration for why people are still upset with this deal, even if the deal itself, based on the specific charges brought, might be fair or not absurd, at least. It's because there's all kinds of evidence of him using drugs and doing all sorts of untoward things. And he's got shady business dealings. He's got all these accusations against him. And most of that is not involved in this charging. And I think that also lends this air of, well, is this really fair? Is he getting special treatment because he's the president's son? And that's where I think it's hard to make up your mind exactly about, well, he might not have been charged with this at all if he wasn't Hunter Biden.
Right.
If he wasn't Hunter Biden, maybe he'd be charged with other things. It's hard to, look at the totality of it and try to be fair-minded about the whole thing and not just, picking a tribe or partisan side when you examine this, right?
But let's look at that for a second, though. So, like, he's doing drugs all over the place, sometimes on video, but generally people only get hooked up and prosecuted for doing or having drugs when they're caught with them. The cops don't go and say, hey, I see this rap video. Let's go investigate whether that was real drugs in the video. That's just not something they do. You can have a YouTube channel where you're, doing whatever you want to do in terms of drugs, and no one's going to investigate you or charge you. I think the thing that people are really upset about is this concept that he's involved in some sort of, influence peddling and some sort of skeevy getting huge amounts of money because of his connection to his father, now the president. And the truth there is that I'm sure they looked at that, but influence peddling isn't inherently a federal crime. So if you don't have actual bribery, if you don't have other certain indicia of crime saying, hey, put me on your board of directors, my dad is a senator or the president or whatever, is not a federal crime. It may be sleazy, but it's just not.
Yeah, and we don't need to get too deep into the whole Hunter Biden cinematic universe thing going on here. There's plenty of other people who are more informed about the details of all the different allegations. But I just wanted to speak a little bit to the general atmosphere of why people might look at this deal, and even if you can articulate why, based on what he was actually charged with, this isn't an insane sweetheart deal necessarily, people might not be satisfied by that. And then at the same time, you also have to look at one of the other reasons would be the politics of it, right? There's you have President Biden, who is a staunch gun control advocate, who is working to tighten gun restrictions in the country, right? Whose ATF just this month reiterated that they will still charge these crimes in Minnesota, which just decriminalized marijuana. And there's many other states that do that. The ATF's position has never changed on this, that this remains illegal, that they will prosecute you, they will investigate and arrest you for it, and you could be prosecuted, even if perhaps in practice it doesn't happen a ton. That's still the stated position. And the president's politics are that he wants more restrictions on guns, yet his son commits a federal felony, a gun crime, and instead of getting jail time, he gets a diversion program.
Well, I think people have a perception that the the children, families of the powerful and famous and rich get a better deal. And I don't think there's any question that they do. And I can see they're highlighting this particular issue. I think it's shameful if the ATF is going to keep prosecuting people who own a gun and use marijuana in states that have decided to make marijuana legal. I think it's terrible as a matter of federalism and all sorts of other reasons.
Obviously Congress plays a role there. The president
Yes.
can't necessarily, he can't change the law, although he has changed interpretations of the law to make them stricter since he's been president when it comes to gun laws. But
he could change priorities. So they've changed priorities about enforcing the still existing federal prohibition on marijuana in states where it's legal, things like that. It's a fair point that there seems to be a discrepancy.
And, I think that's been the main criticism that I've seen from like the National Shooting Sports Foundation, the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep Bear Arms, which is the sister group for the Second Amendment Foundation. They focused mainly on the hypocrisy of it, of like Joe Biden's position on guns and then his son getting at least what they call relatively lenient treatment when he commits a gun crime. And it kind of goes back to this idea that there's lax prosecution of current gun laws. Do you think this is a legitimate example of that, or are they politicizing it too much? What's your take on it?
Well, I think it's fine to think that there's hypocrisy or there's laxness, but I think it should be informed by an accurate picture of what really happens in the system. So a lot of people kind of assume like if there's a crime and the government finds out about it, it gets prosecuted. And that's not really the case. Again, the feds hear about all sorts of federal crimes, and they only investigate a very small number, and an even small number get prosecuted. So the laxness of gun charges and gun prosecutions under existing law is a literally guns and butter decision. It's a decision about how much money to allocate to the Department of Justice and the various agencies to investigate, charge, and prosecute those cases. They could reallocate out, and then some other area is not going to have as much money. But to the extent people are saying that this is unfair because anyone else would have gotten prosecuted and would have taken a felony for this, that's not true. As we talked about at the top of the episode, this is just so rarely charged, and it's almost always when there's some other X factor bringing it in.
Okay. And we mentioned one example of another person in a similar situation, the mother of the child the 6-year-old who shot their teacher, took the mother's gun and shot the teacher. She was charged. That certainly seems to be a case where they're using this charge in lieu of being able to charge her for something else. But let's talk about two other specific examples. Let's talk about one example that's come up sort of from pop culture that I think is probably a really bad comparison, which is so there's a rapper named Kodiak Black who was charged with this same crime and convicted and served 3 years or sentenced to 3 years in prison a little while back. And his lawyer came out and said that, this is an example of the two-tiered justice system. And because Hunter Biden didn't get prison time for with his deal. What would you say about that situation? Because Kodiak Black, my understanding is that his background is quite different.
Yeah, I mean, I think he had a impressive criminal record, and I think that the conduct there involved repeated lies in order to get a larger number of guns, and that he was prohibited as a felon from having anything to do with. So I don't think they're remotely comparable. They do. I mean, if Hunter Biden were already a felon and had the gun, I think it's more likely he would get charged with a felon in possession, and then he'd be looking at real jail time. So again, I think it's a little bit of apples and oranges there. Yeah.
And but let's talk about two cases that I think are a little bit closer, at least in the sense that the people charged didn't have a long rap sheet beforehand. And also, we mentioned this at the top, but Hunter Biden, there was a story again from the Times that indicated he was going to use a Second Amendment defense if this had gone to trial. And I suppose it still could, like we talked about earlier, if he violates this diversion program in some way. Maybe this will end up happening anyway. But there are two cases recently since Bruen was handed down in 2022 where federal judges have called into question the constitutionality of this exact prohibition that Hunter was charged under. And one was a federal judge in Oklahoma. It was the case for a man named Jared Michael Harrison, who was pulled over and found with marijuana and a loaded gun in his car, and he was charged for being in possession, a drug user in possession of a firearm. And his conviction was tossed by this federal judge as being not compliant with the Second Amendment under Bruen. The second example is a judge in Texas who was dealing with a case where a woman was charged for she had marijuana and a gun, but also her husband, she was charged for transferring firearms and ammunition to her husband, who was a user of multiple controlled substances, including cocaine, like what Hunter has said he used. And so both of those were tossed, both of those cases, as the judges determined that this statute can't hold up to Second Amendment scrutiny. Do you think those cases, those charges, are sort of more better analogs to what Hunter was charged with? And what do you think of the potential constitutional challenge he could have perhaps undertaken here?
Well, first of all, they are closer. They are more analogous. I don't know as much about the first one, but I think that was one where the police were looking at him and thought there were more serious things going on, but this is the only thing they could find. The second one, there was involved a larger number of guns and guns being transferred between people, which is, as you know, something the ATF is always super concerned about. So those both had some sort of X factor. And I think that the judges read, I'm not a Second Amendment lawyer, but I think the judges read of the Supreme Court's decision is a reasonable one, and one that if I had a case right now under 922, I would probably be trying to make about all sorts of subsections of that law. I think the field's wide open on these arguments right now. So Hunter Biden may actually be giving up his right to constitutionally challenge the charge in the plea agreement, which is something else we want to see. So if I were a betting man, I would say that when we see the plea agreement, it's going to say that he's agreed to waive indictment by grand jury on this information, agreed to enter a diversion program, and agreed to waive any constitutional challenge to the charge itself in the event that he violates diversion and comes back. That's an educated guess.
I didn't know that was an option. So this is why I like to have people on who know more about the subject than I do.
Stephen, any right you have, the government will ask you to waive.
Usually not a bad idea. Although I will say, my one thing I would ask on that point, because obviously as a firearms journalist, yes, it would be much more interesting to me if Hunter Biden had fought this charge on constitutional grounds and we gotten a U.S. v. Biden Supreme Court case out of it. That would be quite, in the year 2024, right? That would all be quite the political story. But my guess is that if you were his attorney, you would advise him to take this deal over trying to challenge the constitutionality of this federal law. Is that
hell
right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, diversion, not being convicted of a felony, not having this, and challenging the constitutionality of a law in federal court is a big enterprise, expensive, stressful, no guarantee it's going to work, and so on. So yeah, it's a very clear, easy call if you're in that situation. The only way I wouldn't do it is if I thought there was no way that he could last out the 2 years on diversion. If I had grave doubts about that, I'd probably find a different path. So that tells me that his lawyers think that he's at a place now where he can do it.
Okay. Interesting. But yeah, I mean, just as a general point, I know everybody's always cheering for constitutional challenges. And I think that the general public likes to think that, well, if you think your rights have been violated, you should take it all the way to Supreme Court. But in real life, you don't necessarily want to be that Supreme Court defendant, right?
Right.
It's not a pleasant experience.
Because, first of all, he doesn't have an automatic right to go to the Court of Appeals before he gets convicted and sentenced. He could ask for some sort of emergency appeal. That's not likely to work. But if he's being prosecuted and he files a motion to dismiss on the grounds it's unconstitutional, judge says no. Now you've got to go through trial and sentencing and appeal, and you're likely in jail while you're waiting for your appeal. So that's not appealing. So, I mean, not everyone wants to be the test case. It's often not fun to be the test case.
Yeah, exactly. But, I'm also curious of your take on how this might affect other defendants in Hunter Biden's same situation. Like, this is a very high profile deal that's now been made with the president's son. Is this going to have any effect on how federal prosecutors approach these same kinds of cases going forward, or not really?
I expect that other people who get charged with this quite rare charge, 922G3, will raise the argument that, hey, the president's son got a sweetheart deal. Why am I not getting it? They'll raise that argument in plea negotiation. They may even raise it in front of the judge at sentencing. But it probably won't have a big impact. I don't foresee any change in the Department of Justice general approach to this, which is only to use it in cases with some sort of X factor or, where they're trying to get the person for something, and this is what they've got, or where it's just being thrown onto the pile or things like that. So I don't think there'll be a lot of change. The concept of selective prosecution, which you've heard about and people raise, someone charged with it would really have to show that other people who are similarly situated aren't even being charged, which is not the same as him getting a sweetheart deal. So I don't see a lot of changes from it. I see a lot of rhetoric coming. I think we're going to hear in every gun case from here to the end of time, what about Hunter Biden's diversion?
Yeah, probably, right?
Yep.
Next time Kodiak Black is up there for charges, because it doesn't seem like that guy is given his previous rap sheet that this is his last go around. I'm sure he will raise that in court as well, and not illegitimately so, right? I mean, this is a high profile. What the DOJ does here probably should resonate throughout the rest of how it handles things. Or at the very least, defendants can make that case that it ought to.
Absolutely. So, a lot of people are going to be using this in a partisan way, and I don't think you can ignore the partisan issues here, but it's a good thing for Americans to challenge their government about whether or not people who are children of the rich and powerful get special deals and special breaks. I would be thrilled if we all did it more often and in a more bipartisan way. As a criminal defense attorney, you're frustrated to always see people kind of either loving law enforcement or hating it when they're going after their guy, and it just switching depending who's in the dock. But it's generally a good thing, I think, for people to be energized about these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with it, and I think regardless of who the person is that's catching a charge like this, we should examine whether or not it actually is the right way to treat the situation. Like, is a pretrial diversion program for somebody who was who's being charged with having a gun while being addicted to drugs, the better solution, if they don't have a previous criminal record, the right path. I mean, it doesn't sound like an absurd path to take. If he violates any of this deal, then perhaps you carry on to the next set of consequences. But, would you want someone that you care about in the same circumstances to be offered the same deal, or somebody you don't know and has no connection to politics whatsoever offered the same deal? Would it still be a fair deal? I think that's the right way to approach it. with all the considerations that we talked about as well earlier, like, his influence peddling and the other evidence of criminality that exists. Is he getting off light on that stuff? That's a harder thing to judge. The best we can do is look at what he actually got charged with, what the deal is, whether that's competent. I think you've done a pretty good job of laying that out, your view of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably most people, it would have gone that it's the same deal on the taxes, and they would have made sure that the conditions of probation and supervised release included drug testing. Maybe they would have added on the gun ban as a term that he negotiated, something like that. But they wouldn't have done the separate diversion, because for no other reason, it's just more paperwork. That doesn't really substantively change things a lot. But I think here there were appearance issues probably contributed to it.
Yeah. All right. Well, we appreciate you coming on and giving the detailed insight that you were able to for this. I think we got a lot of new information that hasn't really been out there. There's a lot of base level takes on this, but I really wanted to get in and understand the context of it, as best we can. And I think you really helped us do that. So where can people go if they want to, hear more of your analysis or read some of your work?
So the Popehat report is a Substack, but more of my time is spent on Serious Trouble, which is a podcast that we talk about cases like this. Just recorded actually our episode about this today.
Wonderful. So yeah, people should head over to that once they're done with this episode and check it out. And if they want to go even deeper on the topic.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And thank you, by the way, for your work in terms of talking to people like that professor and actually digging in to what gets charged and what doesn't get charged. I think that type of reporting, identifying how the system is actually working versus how we assume it's working, is really important.
I agree. I think the context is necessary. It certainly doesn't exonerate Hunter Biden in any way. I'm just trying to show people what happened and the context that matters. I mean, President Biden said that he had done nothing wrong. Clearly, that's not true by Hunter's own admissions and this plea deal. So I don't think this is, just pointing out how this turned out is not some sort of positive thing for Hunter Biden or his father politically either. So it's just important to be discerning about it and give people the best understanding that's possible. That's all I
absolutely
can try to do. So that's what we attempt to do here at The Reload. But we appreciate you coming on, and we'll have to have you on again in the future when we get into some more of these detailed criminal justice stories.
Anytime. Thanks very much.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for the weekly news update. I'm, of course, contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How you doing, Steve?
I'm doing pretty good, Jake. Phillies play tonight, so hopefully they can break out of this mini slump here since they embarrassed themselves with the Braves the last two games. I'd like to get back on track. It's June. They're supposed to win every game in June. They're still outside the wild card, so I don't know. We'll see. How are things going with you?
Things are good. I'm actually pretty excited this week. I got a new toy that came in the mail that I'm pretty stoked about. I purchased an M1 Garand from the Civilian Marksmanship Program. So for listeners who don't know, the Civilian Marksmanship Program works with the federal government, specifically the Department of Defense, to take old surplus military rifles, some pistols sometimes too, but predominantly rifles, and make them available for civilians to purchase. And so I was able to get an M1 Garand through that program. And it's been a lifelong goal of mine to get an M1 Garand as someone who's kind of a little bit of a World War II buff. So
yeah,
pretty
that's
stoked
awesome
about that.
For anyone who doesn't know, the M1 Garand was the main infantry battle rifle for the American Army in World War II. So if you've ever watched a World War II movie or show, you've certainly seen one before. You have it with you?
That's right. Yeah, it's right here.
For all the people watching on YouTube, we get a shot of it.
It's still got the CMP tag on it, but here it is.
And did you look up the background of this particular gun, the serial number and everything?
That's right. So then when you order from the CMP, there's no way to, specifically get, oh, I want a World War II. It's sort of luck of the draw. And I just so happened to luck out. I looked up the receiver. First of all, it's a Springfield model, Winchester, Springfield. A few different companies manufacture these, and I got a Springfield one.
Okay.
And I looked up the serial number, and it turns out it was manufactured in the summertime of 1942. So it was during the war, and so there's a very good chance that this specific receiver, saw actual combat, or at the very least was issued to someone during the war. So that adds some cool points, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. It's a piece of history, really. It's a collector's item.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the CMP is fantastic. I know that they started selling off the old 1911s a few years back as well.
Yeah.
I actually should get one of those. I kind of want a Remington.
I would say they're doing another round of that right now. I believe that you can actually try to get one of their old 1911s currently.
Yeah, I should look into that. How hard was this whole process, by the way?
So with the rifles, it was not too bad. You fill out a form. You have to obviously show proof of citizenship, so like a birth certificate or a passport. You have to sign like a notarized affidavit, which is essentially the questions that are on the 4473 that you would fill out at a gun store. So just a notary has to verify that you're saying, I'm not a felon, I'm not, a prohibited person, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And then you have to show that you have some sort of marksmanship training. So a concealed carry permit counts for their purposes. So I just put a photocopy of my concealed carry permit. And then you have to actually just mail it in to them. That's the only way to do it. You can't do it through like an online portal or anything. And once you mail it in, as long as everything looks good to them, they just get back to you. They say it takes 2 to 3 weeks. For me, it took about a month, but just a month later, it ships right to your door. You don't even have to get it from a gun store. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's the beauty of working directly with the government, I guess.
Right.
They can just bypass all their own rules.
Right.
How much did you pay for it?
So this is a service grade. So it was $900 flat. No. I didn't have to pay for the background check, didn't have to pay tax, just flat $900, and it was mine.
That's not bad for a collector's item like that. Obviously, there's a lot of M1s out there, but that's still. I think if you were to go into a gun store and try to buy one, it'd be significantly more than that.
Yeah,
these days, and especially one from 1942.
Right.
You get a markup there for sure. So that's a pretty cool deal. Have you shot it yet?
I have not had a chance to take it out to the range. I'm actually, really excited to do that. I don't know if I'll be able to get out this weekend, but I'm itching to test it out for sure.
Yeah, I bet. I should look into getting one of those for my dad. He's not a big shooter, but he is a big World War II buff, like all dads, I guess.
Right.
He likes the M1 Garand. Maybe I'll pick up one for him for his birthday or something like that. I also want to get a 1911 for myself. I have I got a Remington R1 enhanced that I've got, a nice Cerakote P51 Mustang design on it.
I was going to say the Mustang. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was a gun that I had painted up during when I was at the Free Beacon. It has the Free Beacon logo on it, actually, for anyone who recognizes the Washington Free Beacon logo. But so I kind of always have wanted a 1911 by Remington from. Really, I'd love to get one from the early World War I run of these guns, but those are very expensive on the civilian market. Whereas if you go through the CMP, it's a little bit of a crapshoot. Like you said, you don't get to pick out the exact model necessarily, but you could end up with a gun from that era quite easily. Interestingly, and this will actually connects with our first news story. Did you know that after the war, the government sold off millions of M1 Garands, M1 carbines, which is like the cut down version of that M1 Garand to NRA members and other collectors. And this became a significant problem with the National Firearms Act. Have you ever heard this story?
I didn't know this part. No.
Yes. So if you notice in the National Firearms Act, the definition of short barrel rifle is different from the definition of short barrel shotgun. The length of the barrel is different. On shotguns, it's 18 inches. Anything under 18 inches is a short barrel shotgun. And for rifles, it's 16 inches. Now, it wasn't always like that. It started off 18 inches for both. However, in the post-war era, the government sold off surplus M1s, the carbines, which have a barrel that is 16 and a half inches long, without realizing that they were violating the National Firearms Act. They transferred out all these firearms in a similar way that the civilian marksmanship program works. And this became an issue, obviously, because, that's those guns were unregistered NFA items effectively, which is a felony to possess. Same issue we're dealing with here today with the pistol brace situation. But so their solution, really quite elegant solution, was just to change the law. So they modified the law so that for rifles, it's 16 inches now. They didn't change it for shotguns, but they did for rifles.
That's funny. I didn't know that story.
Yeah. So the government is the largest distributor of illegal NFA items in history. But then they fixed their own mistake by just changing the law. You can do that when you're the government, I guess. Right. And they're doing, I suppose that's what they're doing again with this pistol brace situation. They're changing the law without actually rewriting it.
Right.
Through interpretations, through reclassification instead of actual legislation, which brings us to our main story today, which deals with the Senate's attempt to repeal the pistol brace ban, or at least the vote to do so, which actually lost, somewhat surprisingly. I think we had talked about this after it passed the House last week, and it was going to the Senate, and there was, at least to me, I thought there was a pretty good chance it was going to pass, because this is a specialized piece of legislation, right? Or really not legislation. It's a resolution, but it's a privileged resolution. Sorry. And that means that there was going to be an up and down vote on it. There was no way to, even though Democrats control the Senate, they didn't have any opportunity to block voting on this resolution, and they couldn't add amendments to it or anything like that. So they were going to have to take an up or down vote. And they've done this 5 times previously since Republicans took the House under what's called the Congressional Review Act. And what the Congressional Review Act is a piece of legislation that allows Congress to comment on or basically undo regulations from the executive branch agencies if they think that they're against the purpose or the spirit or the letter of the law that Congress passed, right? So it's sort of Congress's way of saying, hey, your executive agency, your interpretation of this law is wrong. And so we're going to undo what you've done through, federal rulemaking process. However, the CRA resolutions don't require the same sort of legislative process as normal legislation does. And so you've had 5 of these pass since Republicans retook the House, which means that they got at least 2 Democratic votes in the Senate for each of those 5 resolutions. Now, the president has vetoed every single one of them, and this makes sense, right, if you think about it, because who controls the executive branch agencies making these rules, right? It's the president, and he's probably in favor of the rules since his branch of the government made them. The agencies he controls made them. And so Congress can pass the resolutions, but he still has the opportunity to veto them, and to override his veto is the same process as normal legislation, meaning you need 2/3 of both houses to do it. And they haven't obviously gotten to that for any of the resolutions, but still it's a political win when Republicans are able to force the president to veto something, especially something supported by some of his own party's senators. And it looked to me like that was the direction this was going to go in, right? Because you're talking about a ban that affects millions of gun owners, where the practical outcome has been millions of people are now federal felons because they didn't comply with this new rule. As we reported, when the ATF announced that they only received about 250,000 registration applications, and even the ATF's lowest estimate puts the number at 3 million pistol braces. The Congressional Research Service puts it much higher, of course, but that means that in practice, there are a lot of people who right now have an unregistered NFA item. And that's a significant problem for, I would think, a number of these Democratic senators, but apparently not. They all joined to support or to oppose the resolution to support the rule. Manchin even came out and said, he put out a statement that said this was the right balance between stopping mass shootings and protecting Second Amendment rights, that he insisted that it wasn't a ban on pistol braces. He didn't answer any follow-up questions that I sent them, like, why does he not consider it a ban? Would he agree to add other firearms to the NFA retroactively like this? He didn't say, but yeah, so it didn't make it through. And I think that's a little bit more significant than people might like to believe on the gun rights side, for a number of reasons.
Yeah, I think the politics of this are fascinating because, as you said, a lot of these moderate sort of swing state-ish senators have been more than willing to go against the president on these, as you said, these 5 previous CRAs, especially the gas stove one comes to mind because I work in energy policy in my other job. But Manchin was very willing to publicly go pick a fight with the president and go against it. And it's weird that firearms would be the hill that he's willing to, or fall in line with his party over, considering the state he represents and the fact that he's up for re-election so soon. I just think the politics of this are pretty fascinating.
Especially because it's not like it's universal background checks or something like that Manchin supported in the past. This is a ban. I mean, he doesn't want to call it a ban, but people bought these guns for about a decade legally, millions of them. And now the ATF is saying, well, if you hold on to those and you don't register them with us, you're a felon, basically. I don't know, we try to lay everything out and how it works so that people can make up their own decision on what they want to call it. I'm very comfortable calling it a ban for that fact. But regardless, it's a very expansive gun control policy. And it is surprising to see all of the Democrats on board with it, including Manchin and King and Tester and Sinema and Hassan. Some of these, some of them have been little hit or miss as far as other policies, but they've all expressed some sort of opposition to new gun bans in the past. And I don't, especially because this wasn't going to become law, right? It wasn't going to make it past the veto. So it's a bit surprising to see them go this direction. And I know that the Republicans were surprised that it ended up this way too. I talked to a number of Republican staffers in the lead up to this who thought they were going to get some Democratic support and it was going to get through. And all the Democratic offices that I reached out to, none of the potential swing voters expressed any definitive stance against the resolution before the vote actually happened. Manchin's office told me that he was considering it up, and then apparently thought better of it. So yeah, the politics of it's bad for gun rights advocates for sure. I mean, instead of showing that the president and his party are divided on this issue, it's done the exact opposite of that. And then of course, it also creates a problem for the legal case against the ban, because most of these lawsuits, the key questions aren't about the Second Amendment necessarily. They're more focused on agency power, whether the ATF has the authority to reclassify pistol-braced guns as short barrel rifles that need to be registered and taxed and so forth. And so, if you had both houses of Congress say, hey, the ATF, you're doing this wrong. This is not how we intended this law to work. That's a stronger argument in court in favor of getting rid of the ban than having the House pass it and having the Senate reject it. Right.
Right.
I don't think it's a death blow to the lawsuits by any stretch of the imagination. I think they still have a pretty solid chance of succeeding, but it does weaken the argument a bit. So in the end, the resolution, it's bad news for people who are trying to repeal that pistol brace ban. And it's good news for President Biden and his allies.
Yeah, I was just going to say it also presents a unified front on this issue in terms of the gun control position, like you said, for Joe Biden and then for the Democratic Party as well. So, yeah,
it does. It does. It turned out to be a win for them. I don't really know why this was like you mentioned, right? I mean, they had 5 other CRA resolutions have passed and made it to Biden's desk where he had to veto them. I don't know why the senators on the Democratic side decided this was the one where they're not willing to go there. But presumably that's a miscalculation by the Republican side because, would they have gone through with this otherwise? Maybe they would have anyway. But there was probably a little bit of a tell in the fact that only 2 Democrats voted in the House, crossed over to vote for this. So it's not a lot in the House. So even the moderate Democrats in the House or the swing state Democrats in the House, whatever you want to call them, most of them didn't go for it either. So that probably should have been a little bit more of a tell than I took it as, at very least. But yeah, it's also surprising to see something like this go straight party line because you'd think if the politics of it, it sort of implies that the politics of it aren't very clear to the senators, because usually if it's something where, it's clearly a more right-leaning resolution, you might lose a couple Republicans, right? You might lose Murkowski or Collins or Romney. Romney was a co-sponsor of this, first of all, and Collins and Murkowski both voted for it. So it was evenly split. The only Chris Coons, the Democrat from Delaware, didn't vote, but that was because he had a medical appointment, is what his office told me. So I don't think it reflects anything on how he feels about the resolution. I'm guarantee he would have voted the same way as the rest of the Democrats on it. But it's interesting to see no crossovers one way or the other, too. That's sort of my last insight on it. I have a little more that I wrote for members over at the Reload, which, by the way, we're having a sale. So there's a flash sale going on right now. The next 20 people who buy a membership get 20% off. So that'll go pretty fast. We don't do sales very often. For anyone who's listened to the podcast for a while, they probably realizes that. But check that out today, and yeah, you can read the members piece for a little cheaper than normal. But what else we got going on this week?
Yeah, so we have a fact check from CNN of President Biden, speaking of Biden, that I know you contributed on. He made a series of false statements, as he's wont to do, about firearms. And CNN came out and kind of step by step refuted some of the falsehoods that he uttered. And I know you contributed on a few. So, for example, one of them, he said the NRA itself is immune from lawsuits somehow, which is news to us, right? That we've been covering all these lawsuits that the NRA is facing. It's surprising that he would say that, but clearly that's false.
Yeah, that's certainly not true. It seems like he kind of, for a number of these, it feels like he kind of garbled his usual talking points, because usually what the president will say is, one, that the gun industry is totally immune from lawsuits, which is not true either. Right. I believe that's also in this fact check. It's not true. They have liability protections for kind of very similar to what most industries have, which is basically you can't sue the company for the criminal misuse of its product by a third party if they weren't directly involved in any way, right? That's basically what the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act says. And so the president likes to say that you can't sue gun manufacturers. You can sue gun manufacturers. They get sued all the time. SIG is being sued right now over safety questions. Taurus has been sued for similar things. Remington's been sued for the triggers in the Remington 700. Yeah, there's a lot of, if there's a product defect, a design defect, you can sue just like you could over basically any product. So he says that a lot. He makes this claim that the industry is not able to be sued and has extraordinary protections that no other industry has, which is also not true. And then he'll also say that he's the only one who can take on the NRA, and he's defeated the NRA before, and he'll defeat him. Like, that's another common talking point. And I guess he just sort of mashed them both together and got this new lie, which is just not true. The NRA, like you said, we've covered it a bunch. They've been sued by a lot of people and are continuing to be sued by the state of New York, by the Washington, D.C.'s attorney general, by former donors. The list goes on. They don't have any sort of special liability protection.
Right. And then apropos of our last segment, he also said that pistol braces, he says, when you attach a pistol brace to a pistol, it turns it into a gun. Yeah. And then it also gives it a higher caliber bullet once you put that piece of plastic, which is not true.
Yeah. I mean, that one, I feel like you can just say, this is just gibberish at this point. None of this is remotely true. The pistol brace is a brace. It doesn't change the firearm at all. It just allows you to strap it to your wrist or forearm and makes it a little bit easier to shoot the gun one-handed. You can also press them against your shoulder if you want to. They're not designed and intended to be used that way, but that is the thing that makes them controversial, is that people will do that with them. But regardless, it doesn't change the actual firearm in any way. It doesn't change how it shoots. It doesn't change what caliber of ammunition it uses. So yeah, the president is just, it's hard to even try and discern what he's trying to say with that one.
Yeah. And then another one that I kind of like, because it's a variation on one that he's liked to do a lot in the past that he's been fact checked on, where, traditionally he says things like, the Second Amendment doesn't let you own cannons, and you can. Well, this time he says machine guns. He said, first of all, he said he phrased it in such a way to suggest that the Second Amendment, the text of the Second Amendment itself, spells out certain weapons that are prohibited, which of course the Second Amendment is silent on types of weapons.
Right.
But then he says you can't own a machine gun, which is a little more complicated than that, because you actually can, in fact, own machine guns.
Yeah, you can, and you always have been able to. Now, there are regulations. This again goes back to the National Firearms Act. We're talking a lot about the National Firearms Act in this segment because it's relevant to the pistol brace situation and also to the machine gun situation, which now machine guns are a little bit different than everything else in the NFA, because in 1986, Congress did pass a law that banned new sales of machine guns, of fully automatic weapons, to the public. And so you can't buy new ones today as a civilian, but you can buy all the ones that were registered before 1986, which is, several 100,000 of those out there. They're very expensive, but it's certainly not illegal to own them. I mean, and same thing for cannons. It's actually even more true for cannons, because, the cannons that existed at the founding weren't regulated and still aren't regulated today. You can buy a black powder cannon without any sort of regulation. Really, you can buy them off eBay, right, if you want to. They're not very popular anymore, but they're certainly legal, and they were certainly legal at the founding. You could own a warship at the founding if you wanted to, the equivalent of a 19th century or 18th century battleship. You could own. People did. That's what privateers were. That's how the Navy got started, right? John Paul Jones, he owned his own ship. That was a private enterprise. Anyway, yeah, the president's knowledge of the founding era gun regulations is not is not very expansive, and it's often incorrect.
Right. And then the last falsehood was a little more forgivable, but still a little bit, he exaggerated. He claimed that his late son, Beau Biden, was the first person to use a red flag law.
Right.
He was previously the Attorney General of Delaware. And the problem with this is, while he was a proponent of red flag legislation and he tried to get one introduced, the red flag law didn't exist until after Beau Biden had passed away. So first of all, red flag laws have existed since the 90s. So whether or not he would have been the first is not, wouldn't have been possible. But he also had sadly passed away before that was even on the books. So,
yeah, I mean, this one, the president makes a lot of incorrect statements about his late son for some reason. He claims that he died in Iraq, which isn't true either. Now, the red flag law in Delaware is named after Beau Biden.
Right.
So maybe that's where this is coming from. But yeah, certainly it's not true. And so it's, just another pretty straightforward falsehood on the president's part here.
Yeah. So yeah, those were the 5 latest from the president that you contributed to.
I think there was one more, right? About there was one about the law that he signed last year. And this one wasn't, I think it was even less egregious than the other ones, but he claimed that there was no,
the boyfriend
no way
loophole.
for
That's right.
That domestic abusers can't buy guns at all now, period. And I guess the quibble with that is that while the law that he signed last year did expand the definition of domestic abuser to include people who were dating partners, it also included a provision that allowed people to regain their gun rights if they didn't reoffend within 5 years.
Yeah.
So that was the one caveat to that claim as well.
That's right. Yeah.
So, they kind of got less and less severe as you sort of go down the list, but and more comprehensible as to how he got to the falsehood. But yeah, the president, he talks about guns a lot more often than we write about him talking about guns, and a big reason for that is he just kind of uses the same anecdotes over and over again and makes the same claims, often false claims over and over again. Not that this is unique to Joe Biden. Politicians do this all the time. They have a stump speech that they go out and give, and they hit the same points over and over again. And so it's just of diminishing news value, I think. The 15th time he uses the F-15 anecdote about how, actually, I think that's one of his more disturbing ones, honestly, because he talks about the Tree of Liberty, which is a Jefferson quote, right? The Tree of Liberty was to be refreshed with the blood of patriots and tyrants. And he says this is an absurd idea, basically, because you need more than an AR-15 to defeat the government. You'd need F-15s or what have you. And, it's not, I think, a great look for the president of the United States to be out there talking about how the government could crush the people if it wanted to. But regardless, he uses that all the time. Basically, every time he talks about guns, he'll say the same 3 or 4 things. We cover that fact check covers a number of them, but that's part of the reason we don't cover everything he says about firearms, because it's just a lot of it's repeated, and it doesn't. He calls for the assault weapons ban like every other week,
right?
And unless there's some significant change in Congress, that's not going to happen anytime soon. Right. So it doesn't really make sense for us to go out and write about it every single time he says something. Just to explain it for the listeners and readers, how we sort of approach the president and his comments on guns. If it's something new and newsworthy, generally speaking, that's when we'll go and cover something he says. But as the state of the government right now, there's unlikely to be new gun legislation anytime soon. And so there's just not a lot the president can do or say that's going to move the needle at this point.
Yeah,
but it's still important to fact check. And right when he said, I'm glad that CNN did that fact check, and I'm glad that they reached out to me for a couple quotes on it. So and I'm glad that we were able to bring it to you here on the show. That's I believe all we have time for this week. And we will be back again real soon. If you want to help support our reporting, you can head over and check out our flash sale right now and pick up a membership. That is how we fund the Reload here, is through membership dues. The membership is the only thing that makes this all possible. And so if you want to join today, you can go and get 20% off while supplies last. But yes, we don't do sales very often. So this is a fairly unique thing. Make sure you take advantage if you are able. Otherwise, you can sign up for our free newsletter to get a taste of what our reporting is like beyond this episode of the podcast. And, of course, you can share this with your friends and family, anyone else who might be interested to help us grow. That's a big part of keeping us afloat. And leave a comment, leave a like, leave a review. All those things help spread the word. So we will be back again real soon. Thank you, guys.
No, the devil's got no